Greetings and welcome to the Otherworldly. This is Tripicon, your host, and tonight my guest is the incredibly cool, excuse me while I fangirl, Sara Mastros, and I will put up a couple of links to other shows she's done for us, which is very cool, in the chat, so you can go and get a bigger dose. Tonight, she's talking about her new book, the Sorcery of Solomon. Did I get that right?
Sorcery of Solomon.
Very embarrassing if I said it wrong.
I've actually said the name of this book wrong on video in more than one interview. So here's an Easter egg for everybody. If you stalk me on YouTube, count how many times I say the wrong name for my book. We renamed it relatively late in the process. So it is actually called The Sorcery of Solomon, A Guide to the 44 Planetary Pentacles of the Magician King.
But what was it going to be before?
The Planetary Pentacles of Solomon, Magician King.
Oh, and they just thought it would be cooler to call it Solomon.
The marketing department at Weiser, I don't know if this is true or not, but they seem like they know their business, say that book titles with numbers in them sell better. So now I'm just going to put numbers in all my titles.
Who knew?
I mean, fascinating, right? But like, things like Amazon algorithm are so ridiculous that I'm sure that's true. Like, they know their business. So
yeah. Anyway, so this is in my way of looking at it, kind of ceremonial magic, which is something that I haven't done much since I was just getting into magic and wanted to do things like that. Mm-hmm. So I was like, oh, okay, but she's coming on, so I'm going to read it, and oh my gosh, it was so friendly and so understandable that I was able to follow it in a way that you're not going to get from, was it Eliphas Levi? The ones that the other ones I've tried and said, okay, I'm going to be a hedge witch.
Well, you're really like my exact target reader. So, every book I write, I try and think really carefully, like and keep in mind like particular people that I am writing for. And so for this book, I am really thinking about people like you who have a lot of experience with like magic generally, but don't have a lot of experience in Solomonic magic. Or my other target reader is like Jews who have little experience of magic but would like to get some. Those are like my two target audiences for this book, really.
That's cool. Okay, I think we probably ought to mention Ceremonial magic is not necessarily Solomonic magic. We should probably say what Solomonic magic is.
So that is a surprisingly hard question to answer. Personally, no. I mean, that's a good question. That's what I'm here to do, is answer hard questions, right? So I generally, the easiest way to understand it is that, in my opinion, Solomonic magic is magic that at least claims to derive its sort of source, right? So not necessarily the source of its power, but the source of its teaching from Solomon, the legendary magician king. So if a book is named after Solomon and it teaches magic, then in my book, that's Solomonic magic. But in a tighter sense, Solomonic magic is a kind of spirit-based magic, right? Where you're like calling and interacting with spirits. And it develops, it has a lot of complicated historical roots, and then it like branches out a lot in history. So unlike sometimes like when we're talking about, say, reconstructed pagan magic, right? Solomonic magic is very much a living tradition with like an unbroken chain of transmission running, depending how early you're willing to be. I think even the most conservative person would say that Solomonic magic starts to arise in like maybe the 4th century BCE. And I think it is very reasonable to push it back even a couple centuries earlier than that. So as I said, it combines a lot of different historical sort of roots come together to form it, but it's really a combination of sort of Hebrew and Jewish, primarily like amulet magic, textual Hebrew magic, right? And Hebrew spirit magic with like a Greek goetic kind of spirit magic, right? And so when those two things start to fuse, It's this really sort of like rich ground, right? And other things are feeding into Babylonian astrotheology, Egyptian priestcraft, but really Solomonic magic is rising out of Hellenic Judaism in late antiquity, right? And then traveling through, and then a lot of times when we talk about Solomonic magic in English, people are only thinking about late medieval and early Renaissance Christian Solomonic magic, right? But there's lots of other Solomonics. There's an entire Jewish tradition of Solomonic magic. There's an entire Muslim tradition of ceremonial magic. There's an entire Middle Eastern pagan tradition of Solomonic magic. And there's lots of Greek pagan Solomonic magic before that starts to turn into the Christian kind, right?
Just to interject, I'm in audience A, by the way.
Sure.
I was going to say, in my role as host,
sure,
we need to define goetic.
So Goetia, the word itself, the root word goes, means to howl or wail, right? It's a kind of spirit sorcery from ancient Greece. So we have a couple different words for like what we would call magic in ancient Greek, right? The first one is pharmakoeia, which is the root of our word like pharmacy. And it's mostly what we would today call like witchcraft, right? Particularly like sort of, okay, look, let me back up a second and talk about this first. I think that, and so this is really like a warning for beginners. I think that beginner magicians sometimes get really hung up on like categorizing different kinds of magic. But like as an experienced magician, and I think probably other experienced magicians will probably agree with me, when I'm actually doing it, I'm almost always like combining lots of different kinds of magic together. So I'm really only talking about these categories in order to like just share a common vocabulary to teach, right? So before I talk about kinds of magic in ancient Greece, let me talk a little bit more broadly, give somebody like a structure for categories of magic today. Is there a question in the chat window?
No, I just put down how to spell goetta.
Oh, yeah, perfect. Right. So Agrippa, I'm going to use Agrippa's categories because I think they're like relevant to this particular conversation. So he basically outlines 3 categories of magic. The first one is natural magic, which today we might call sympathetic magic. And again, that's largely like sort of witchcrafty type questions. Oh, it says there is it. Let me go. So guys, it's hard for me to look at the chat window. So if you guys could audibly interrupt me, that would be a million times easier for me. So there's a question on the chat window.
How does this relate to the magic of Abramelin?
So I'm going to come back and talk about that. I mean, I think the magic of the magic of Abramelin, I would certainly characterize as Solomonic magic, and I think most people would too. That being said, Solomonic magic is like a really big category that includes lots of things. So the particular book I'm going to talk about today is maybe only like tangentially related to the magic of Abramelin, but certainly the book of Abramelin is very much inside the Solomonic tradition and is really inside, I'm going to talk in a minute about like a tighter category of Hebrew amulet magic. So that's a good question. I know I only a little bit answered it. I'm going to come back and answer a little bit more detail in a little bit, right? So Agrippa's got these 3 categories. Natural magic, which is the way I think about it, is it's magic that's rooted in matter, right? So magic with plants or stones, but also magic that's rooted like in your human body, right? So like Reiki, I think, is something that excuse me, that Agrippa would put in that first category. His second category he calls celestial, but today I think we would probably call it astrological. So that's magic that is really rooted in time, right? So we have this first category rooted in matter, the second category rooted in time, right? So sometimes when we talk about astrological magic, and I am not saying this is a wrong way to talk about it, I'm just clarifying that this is like for what I'm saying, it's not necessarily the best way to think about it, right? We often think about astrological magic as like rays emanating from celestial bodies, right? And it's not that that is false, but in this Agrippa system, and for the point I want to make, it's better if you think about it like astrology is really just a really sophisticated clock or calendar, right? Like we're talking about, like when we talk about the movements of celestial bodies, what we're really doing with them is measuring time, measuring like the complex polyrhythm of the natural divine music that is right, like in as much as we think about creation as a symphony, right, we here on earth use astrology, right, to help us keep track of the complex polyrhythms in it, right? Just like we all know lots of those rhythms, and astrology is really just more complicated ones, right? So he's got this category of magic based in matter, this second category based in time, and then he has a third category that he calls divine magic, but I might call abstract magic, which is really, I might even call it ideal magic, but not ideal like perfect, ideal like related to ideas, right? And so those three categories, we have sort of like similar kinds of categories, not identical, but similar kinds of categories in ancient Greece, right? So we have pharmakeia or witchcraft, right? Again, very closely related to our English word pharmacy, right? Or pharmaceutical, right? And the next word we have is an imported word, magia, right? Which is the root of our word magic, right? And that is primarily astrological magic in ancient Greece, right? And then we have this third category, goetia, right? Which again, the root word means to wail, right? It's closely associated. So even in modern Greek today, in modern Greece 50 years ago and now as a tradition that is really almost starting to die out, except in like certain scattered islands, you would hire professional mourners, like these older women usually, to come and wail at a funeral, right, as part of a funeral practice. And those women are generally also understood to engage, like in pre-Christian times in particular, are understood to engage in a relatively like what we might call like a shamanic, right, a spirit-based, right, a kind of magic built on intercourse, not like sexual intercourse, but just communication, knowledge and conversation of spirits, right, and making alliances and making compacts with spirits, right? That's goetia.
Kind of a rental banshee.
I don't know much about banshees, but don't they wail to like warn you of a coming death?
I'm sure there's a little wiggle room, but yes.
Yeah, sorry to be so literal. I'm like very deep in teacher mode right now.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Right?
I was also wondering if sublunary magic, or what is sometimes referred to as that, would come under the heading of natural magic.
I think when we say sublunary magic, it's not exactly like identical with that natural category that like I outlined from Agrippa. And that's what I'm saying about like the ways we categorize it. You know, everybody's got their own ways to categorize things, and I picked the categorization system that would make the point I wanted it to make, right? Which is that we've got these three categories in ancient Greece, right? And then these three categories in Agrippa, right? And so that's what goetia means. Goetia means basically like spirit magic. However, there is also a specific book of Solomonic magic called the Ars Goetia, the Art of Goetics, right? And which is a spirit catalog. It's a catalog of demons and instructions for conjuring them and making pacts with them.
The idea of howling also reminded me of something else. Unfortunately, it's a fictional reference. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, in which the author, Susanna Clark, has Jonathan Strange conjure back a set of dead soldiers. And the first thing they start doing is speaking in a language that seems to be largely made up of screaming, which he says, I believe that they are speaking a dialect of hell.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
And the Iron Duke, whatever his name was.
Wellington?
Wellington, yes. Wellington. He's doing this on Wellington's behalf because they're looking for information. And Wellington nods approvingly because he likes people being businesslike and learning things quickly.
Nice. So we have these categories of magic, right? And so in many ways, I would say Solomonic magic very much partakes of all of those, right? I will say sometimes, look, I totally get what you said about and Solomonic and ceremonial magic at the beginning, because I too found that community deeply unwelcoming when I started, right? And I'm a nerd. Like, I already had a little bit of Greek and a little bit of Hebrew and was well into what would eventually turn into a graduate degree in theoretical math. So like, it's not like I didn't have the nerd bona fides, just like you are like a super smart big nerd. I do find, I feel like, real talk, every kind of magic community has their own bullshit, sorry for my language, that you have to like wade through. And like Solomonic magic has a lot of like Solomon bros, and witchcraft has a lot of like white feminist nonsense, and chaos magic has a lot of straight up fucking Nazis. So like, you know what I mean? You get like, there's stuff worth it in every community, but I understand what you're saying, right? It does have this reputation, right, for being like a very technical and very abstract kind of magic, right? So I was talking before about this third category, abstract magic, that Agrippa calls divine magic, right? That is a magic unbound in either matter or time, right? And it's primarily magic of like magic words and formulas and ideas, right? And so Solomonic magic very much partakes of all three of those. Solomon himself is famous for doing all three. But for whatever reason, like again, I think owing to the fact that most people are talking exclusively about Christian Solomonic magic, right? I think sometimes people discount the natural elements in Solomonic magic, but Solomon famously spoke to the trees and the plants. Although I have noticed that many Christian Torah translations say that he spoke about trees and plants, but the Hebrew text surely implies that he spoke with trees and plants, right? And he's so famous for his knowledge of herbalism that like when he is blah blah blah, there's a whole folkloric story about how like Ashmedai, the demon whose Christian name is Asmodeus, right, steals Solomon's ring and impersonates him, right? And then Solomon is like wandering as a beggar, but he doesn't have his magic ring anymore. Like his magic is bound, but he still has all his like magic adjacent knowledge, like herbalism. And so he gets a job in the kitchen of the king of what is now Jordan, and like uses his knowledge of plants to like rise once again to fame and fortune in that court, right? Like Solomon in Rastafarianism, Solomon like discovered marijuana. Like he is famed for his knowledge of natural magic and witchcraft as well, right?
Donga King.
Yeah, right? Like honestly, every fact I learn about Solomon, he just gets cooler and cooler and cooler. Like I genuinely love Solomon the Magician King, right? So this book in particular is about the planetary pentacles, right? So they're a kind of Hebrew amulet, right? Which, as I said, like, so here's like what I would think of as like a relatively typical example of one, just to like give you an idea what they look like, right? Almost all of them are circular. They're in Hebrew. I mean, sometimes they exist in translation, but they are certainly like originally Hebrew, right? And they sometimes have like some geometry, but they're pretty much made out of words, right? And a little bit of geometry and occasionally some other kinds of symbols, right? So they're very much in that abstract category, right? The pentacles themselves are, which is what my book is about. So those pentacles have existed for a long time. They are sort of, and I'm going to come back and qualify that sort of in a second, part of a particular text in Solomonic magic, perhaps what I think of, and I think many people think of as sort of like the archetypal text in Solomonic magic, which is called the Key of Solomon. Now, as a side note, there are two books, sometimes called the Key of Solomon. There's like the Key of Solomon proper, sometimes called the Greater Key of Solomon. And then there's another text called the Lemegeton, or the Lesser Key of Solomon, which is also awesome and is where Ars Goetia is, but that's not what I'm talking about right now, right? So in the Key of Solomon, right, we talk about it as if it's a single book, but it's not. It's like a family of closely related texts over history. And depending like how loosely you're willing to put the boundaries on that family, it starts with something called the Testament of Solomon in Hellenic Jewish late antiquity, right? But the copies of the Key of Solomon that we are familiar with really are starting in like the 14th and 15th century. The earliest known copies are in Italian. Many people think it is, or are in Latin from Italy, and many people like think it was originally composed in that language. I am sort of agnostic on, I mean, I would say it's originally composed in Greek, because I would say the Testament of Solomon, which is definitely composed in Greek, is a early form of the Key of Solomon, but I'm getting a little fuzzy with which book is which at that point, right? But that book has 2 books in it, a book 1 and a book 2. The Pentacles are actually not in book 1 or book 2. They're in between the 2 books in some manuscripts, and not all of the manuscripts of the Key of Solomon contain Pentacles at all. And when they do, they're not always exactly the same Pentacles. So I believe that the Pentacles are actually like originally a separate text from the Key of Solomon that is added in later, right? So, and the Pentacles themselves, right? So I said that like the Key of Solomon, although it claims to be Jewish, right? Like it says that is a translation of a Hebrew Jewish text. Is that true or not? I don't know. Like Christians are fond of claiming that things about Judaism are true that just aren't true. So it's hard to say, right? And I also understand that, like, you know, in Christian grimoires, the word grimoire basically means wizard textbook. Yo, Solomon bros lose their shit when I say that, by the way. Like that grimoire means Solomon textbook, but it does. The word grimoire is closely related to our English word grammar. It means a textbook. So grimoire is like a kind of a wizard textbook. And all of these books I've been talking about are grimoires, right? You know, the Christian ones, they have a real tendency to like obfuscate themselves, right? And I do understand that some of that is because the magic they are discussing is at least borderline illegal in the cultures and places and times they're writing. So like, I do appreciate that not citing your sources is the same as not naming names. But the nice thing is that like in Jewish sources, there's not that pressure. And so Jewish sources, on Solomonic Magic, just give a lot more information, right? They'll say like, my name is this, my dad's name is this, I copied this text from this guy, his dad's name is this, he lives in this city, he copied it from this guy, this other part I copied from here, and I've seen many copies of this manuscript, and this one says this, but that is obviously wrong because blah, 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 right? They just have a lot, they're not trying to like hide their identity as a magician, right? So they tend to have a lot more information.
It's got to make it easier not having to do semantic analysis to try and determine where the original texts came from.
Well, I mean, yes and no. The thing is that Christian texts and European language texts are much better preserved and much better studied, right? So like the same forces that are keeping Christians magicians in hiding are burning Jews, magicians or not, at the stake. Like the overwhelming majority of people prosecuted by the Inquisition were not prosecuted for being magicians. They were prosecuted for being Jewish, right? Yep. So it is better, but I mean, like there is also this additional pressure, right, on that community. And that means that Hebrew manuscripts of magic are relatively difficult to find and are not well studied, right? So this book is based on a magician named Samuel Little McGregor Mathers, right, is one of the founders of the Golden Dawn. And his wife, Moina Mathers, right, her maiden name is Mina Bergson. She's Henri Bergson's little sister. Her family, she comes from an important Jewish family. So like her grandmother, I guess maybe her great-grandmother, her father's grandmother, I suppose, Temeril Bergson, was like instrumental in the founding of modern Hasidism, right? So like to give you for people who know what that means, like big deal Jewish family, there is every reason to believe that that she would have come up with a relatively good Jewish education. And if you look at kind of a timeline of Mather's books, you'll notice that after they marry, suddenly his Hebrew gets a lot better, right? So even though, go ahead.
I just had a question, because one of the things that I love new alphabets and codes and stuff. So I was kind of thinking I should probably learn Hebrew. If I'm going to use any of these things, I mean, you ought to be able to write the script before you start writing it on a pentacle. And I said, do I have to do how much do I? And so that, do you need that or not?
So opinions
Just
vary.
help.
I mean, personally, I am of the opinion that okay, one, let me say this. I am in no way suggesting that you have to learn Hebrew, right? So now we're asking, do you have to learn the Hebrew alphabet, right? I mean, like, probably no, but like, hand to God, guys, it's an alphabet. Like, a 6-year-old can learn it in a week. It's not rocket science. Like, if you ask YouTube, it will show you all kinds of songs for learning the Hebrew alphabet. And the truth is, I do honestly find it like a little bit disrespectful when people are doing Hebrew amulet magic and they haven't even bothered to learn the alphabet. Like,
yes.
So, on that vein, the book will teach you the alphabet. Like, yeah. Right? It'll teach you the alphabet. It'll teach you about the history of the Hebrew language, because the magic on the Pentacles is Hebrew language magic. And there are certain features of the Hebrew language, like, for example, being written without vowels, right, that really come into play in Hebrew magic, right? And one of the reasons is because words are written without vowels. Like, if you picked out 3 English letters at random and put them in the row, the chances of that being a word is very, very low, right? But in Hebrew, it's like more than a third of random 3-letter combinations form words, right? And most Hebrew root words are 3 letters, right? So, and that kind of fluidity in writing, right? Another thing that means is that, like, the same written word, because the vowels aren't written, can actually represent a variety of closely related words. And those sort of features give you a lot of opportunities for, like, word play, which is really important in Hebrew poetry and in Hebrew magic, right? So the Pentacles are a kind of, as I said, in those 3 categories, abstract magic. They rely on magic words and names, and those words and names are in Hebrew, right? So a lot, it's like, I am in no way suggesting you need to know what those names mean in order to make these Pentacles work. Many people who are already very sophisticated magicians can make Pentacles work without knowing what they say, because instead of approaching them as this abstract magic, right, you can approach them strictly goetically, right? You can, like, conjure up spirits with whom you already have a relationship and just kind of get them to do the magic for you, which means you don't need to know how the pentacle works, right? You can cast them as astrological talismans at, like, appropriately elected times, right? You can cast them in the appropriate metal, write them with the appropriate ink, burn the appropriate incense, bring in all those natural magics. But if you don't know what the words mean, and the meaning of those words was not, like, centered in the magical construction, then in my opinion, what you have created is not a Solomonic pentacle. It is some other kind of amulet, which is decorated to look like a Solomonic pentacle, right? Which is, like, fine. People can do that if they want. But, like, the real power of these things is in the names, right? And so I first encountered the Pentacles when I was probably, I'm going to say, around 16-ish. And my Hebrew is much better now than it was then. But I had, you know, a little tiny bit of Hebrew. Like, I knew the alphabet. I could sound words out. And I could recognize some words, particularly, like, religious-y words, right? Like names for God and things like that I could recognize, right? But that was about the extent of my Hebrew then. And so I saw these Hebrew amulets, and I'm going to imagine that everybody who's been in magic for a while, when they look back at the beginning, there's things that, like, they found pretty early on that you could, like, smell the magic on them. And you were like, oh, I'm going to learn this. This is amazing. Right? I have many of those things. And the Pentacles were one of the very earliest ones, not the super earliest, but the earliest that I had enough to really learn from. So other things I would see, like, a single example. So there was a single example of an invocation from a Babylonian exorcism text in my 7th grade history textbook. And that was amazing. But that history textbook, and I know because I have bought this book on Amazon trying to track it down, does not cite a source, so I couldn't get any more of them. Though I will say now, I can tell from the poetry that it is a Thorkild Jacobson translation of a Mukul tablet, a kind of Babylonian exorcism tablet, right? So these Hebrew amulets, like I encountered them, and some of the words I could read, but even my rabbi couldn't read a lot of them, right? And so as I continued in magic, I would ask like co-magicians and even people who were like holding themselves out as experts on Solomonic magic. I would be like, okay, what does this word mean? And many of them would say things like, I don't know, which is always a perfectly legitimate answer to a question. But some percentage of them would say, it doesn't matter. But like, I don't know. I think it does matter. I think if there are words written on your magic, it probably does matter what they mean. So thus started my 30-year quest to understand every word on these pentacles. And I wrote this book because I was mad that nobody had written this book yet. So, you know, in the first like third of the book, there's basically an on-ramp into Solomonic magic for people with no experience in Solomonic magic whatsoever. But the last 2/3 of the book, that is to say, you know, about 200 pages of this book, maybe a little bit less, there are 44 of these pentacles. I take every single one apart. I analyze every word on it. I explain the word. I give you the etymology of the word. I talk about why I think this particular word is on this pentacle. I talk about like other places in Hebrew amulets and other kinds of Hebrew texts where those words occur. A lot of times I'll give you like rabbinic and Talmudic commentary on like a lot of times there's pieces of verses. So there's usually not whole Torah verses, but there's often short pieces of Torah verses. And occasionally there's names that are coded from Torah verses, right? So that's less true in the Mather's Pentacles, which are quite corrupt, than it is in native Hebrew amulets. But a lot of times, like, you'll take a verse and then say, take the first letter of every word in the verse, and then permute those letters according to a certain magical formula, and you get out a new magic name, right? Now, that is easy to do if you're starting with the verse and ending with the name. But when you have the name and you need to decrypt back to the verse, pretty hard, right? So when we're working with less corrupt ones, right, there's a lot of this like straight up mathematical cryptographic process. But the Mather's Pentacles required a little bit of that, but not too much, right? But I sort of explain all the names, and sometimes I'm making guesses because, again, these pentacles are pretty corrupt. And so some of them I am very confident, like, this word is just misspelled. It should be this. This is not a word, and this would make exact perfect sense if it said this instead, right?
Wouldn't that be just nerding again? Wouldn't computers make it easier to do that?
Yes. So for example, what I'm going to say now is not about this book that is currently out. It's actually about my next book that I'm working on now, right? So one of my reasons for writing this book, like my main reason that I was mad that like I wanted a book that just explained these fucking pentacles to me and said what they said. And as far as I know, and I still mean this, as far as I know, such a book does not exist until I published one. So now there's one, I'm happy, right? But my other goal in this book is the book I'm working on now is called Sefer HaOtot, the Book of Seals, right? It's a Hebrew manuscript of the Pentacles. And I'm just going to show you guys like an example of, let's see. Okay, so I know that this is going to be hard to see. Sorry, I didn't plan this out in advance. So you guys see that pentacle with like all that Hebrew writing on it? So this is what that same pentacle looks like in the Mather's edition. It's got 2 words left.
What?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. These pentacles are corrupt, but they have been reconstituted by Mathers, who has many flaws, but is an excellent, excellent magician, right? And I don't know how much of the Hebrew is him and how much of it is Moina, but between the two of them, they are, to be clear, Moina was also a baller magician. W.B. Yeats said she was the best magician in the Golden Dawn, right? Like, just to be clear, like we only talk about her as Samuel Mather's wife, but she's a badass in her own right. We just don't talk about that because women. But some combination of them, right? Like, these master magicians did restore these pentacles, right? He did his best from all these different corrupt manuscripts that he had access to. He's creating his own versions, which are slightly different, right? And I am in no way saying they're better than in other manuscripts. Like everybody's manuscript is going to have its own biases for how they're written. But I will say that this Hebrew manuscript I am working on now, which was hard to find, I found it like it is mentioned in a footnote in Stephen Skinner's classic book, which I think is called like Techniques of Solomonic Magick or something very close to that. That's close enough that Google will know what I mean. Stephen Skinner wrote a fabulous book introducing Solomonic Magick in, I don't know, a long time ago, right? Maybe like the late 70s or early 80s, maybe the 90s. I honestly have no idea how old that book is, but definitely more than 30 years old at this point, right? Like an older book. And in this footnote, he mentions this Hebrew manuscript of Pentacles, but the way he mentions it led me to believe that I don't think he had ever seen that manuscript. He had just heard of it. So we live in the future now, right? So I talked to that library and I was like, hey, can you just send me a scan of that manuscript? Which I don't know if people know this. Libraries are happy to do, right? Ooh. And so they're like, oh, we don't have that manuscript. And I'm like, I think you actually do. It's going to be inside this other manuscript, et cetera, et cetera. So that is all Stephen Skinner. Like Stephen Skinner found it, but I got to scan out. I started to work. And so I discovered this while I was researching this Mathers book, right? Which like walks you through all the Pentacles. For people who are not Pentacle nerds, I'm not trying to toot my own horn. Like, I think this book covers everything you would conceivably need to know about the Pentacles, right? And again, provides like an on-road into Solomonic Magick. In my opinion, like the Pentacles are one of the easiest places to start in Solomonic Magick, which is why I started there, right? So, but this Hebrew manuscript, so I've been working with it and translating it. The Pentacles have far more writing on them, but there's also much more extensive commentary in the book. This book will be out, I don't know, in a year or two, probably. And so I've been working with, you know, a specialist in Jewish manuscripts, and she and I, you know, I have a background in theoretical mathematics, as weirdly does she. Like a surprising number of people in Jewish magic have backgrounds in math. They kind of go together, right? And which is partly about what I was saying about that like ideal abstract kind of magic, which is most Jewish magic that we talk about falls into that category, but there are lots of other kinds as well. Just people who aren't Jewish don't hear about those kinds, right? But you know, people who are into abstract and ideal math are also math nerds most of the time, right? So she and I worked together. We wrote some computer programs. I say we, she's the one who wrote the computer program. I wrote some pseudocode for it, right? And worked together, and we were slowly working on decrypting the Pentacles. At this point, most, but not all of them are decrypted. And so if you watch me on like Instagram or Facebook, you can see. But all of that is to say, right, that almost everybody, when they come to the Pentacles, they are coming through Mather's edition, which you would think I would know what year it is. I'm going to say like 1890. Probably is his edition. And he is looking at a lot of different Christian grimoire manuscripts of Pentacles and sort of reconciling them together. So I'm going to take a pause because I see a ton of stuff in the chat window. I'm going to remind everybody that I'm talking about Jewish magic and the like correct sort of, like, I know that for many people, especially people who grew up WASPs, like interrupting is uncomfortable, but that is the correct and polite way to talk. It's called cooperative overlap. Like there is a way to learn Jewish magic. Please interrupt me.
I like the term cooperative overlap.
That's a linguistic term for cultures where people interrupt productively.
So it's a conversational strategy, and I'm not culturally programmed for it.
Yes,
yes.
mine. So yeah, that's why.
Okay. Yeah, Reformed Irish Catholic here. Sorry, wrong programming.
Well, I mean, everybody has different programming. I'm really just saying that, like, I really meant it when I said interrupt.
So do you so you want to run through the chat?
Yeah,
check. It's a really good question in there, but I'll let you run through them.
Okay, so the first thing I said is, so a good English-Hebrew dictionary would work. Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, truthfully, like Wiktionary will get you, like, it's good enough for many purposes, right? Also, you know, unlike, say, ancient Greek and modern Greek, which have many, many, many centuries of change in between them, modern Hebrew, like Israeli Hebrew, is a reconstructed language from biblical Hebrew. Like for millennia, no one spoke Hebrew as their mother tongue, right? So modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew are much closer than many ancient languages in their modern forms. So honestly, like Google Translate will get you, like if it's good Hebrew, not like codes and corrupt and blah, 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 right? Like Google Translate will help some, especially if it's Torah verses, because Google Translate just recognizes it. Like if you just, like if you take, you know, 8 words in Hebrew and plunk them into Google, if that's in the Torah, Google's going to figure that out for you. Okay, so the next question says, question for later, how much of the meaning is imprinted into the pentacles themselves? In other words, do the pentacles remember what they are for? So that's a fabulous question. And it a little bit depends what you mean, right? So the words do no, like 100% of the meaning is imprinted into the words, is at least a conceit of all Hebrew magic, right? Is that, but okay, let me preface what I'm about to say, right? So we have a saying in Judaism, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, right? Like there is no central doctrine in Judaism. And even if there was, I am in no sense a rabbinic authority. And if you would like rabbi's opinion on this, you should ask a rabbi. But basically what I'm going to say is that like, when we say that like humans are created in the image of God in Judaism, it is our unique power to name things into being that is like the characteristic that we and God and no other creatures share, right? Like angels can't, that kind of abstract magic where you give something a name that didn't have a name before, angels can't do that, right? Other spirits can't do that. Well, whether they're, I don't mean they are forbidden from it, although some people would say that they have the ability and are forbidden from it. But I think mainstream like Jews would say like they simply can't do it. They do not, like they can't, they just don't have that power. Like that is the power. That's what it means to be created in the image of God, and angels are actually not created in the image of God. Humans are.
I believe I understand. Having done a little work with angel names and their implications, it has struck me that most angels can be, at least in some sense, regarded as parts of the operating system.
Yes, exactly. Right? Angels can't do that kind of naming magic because they are that kind of naming magic. An angel is its name. There's nothing else to them. Like that's what they are. Right? Now, that's not exactly as saying like, you know, the name we know them by. That's like their human corrupted name, right? Even in Hebrew, right? But yes, angels are almost like made out of code in a lot of sort of like mainstream Jewish understandings of the matter, right? But humans are not. Humans are coders. And that is a power shared only by humans and God in like a mainstream Jewish telling, right?
I hope he knew what he was doing when he built that in.
I mean, you know, the nice thing about the Jewish God is that he definitely does, because there's nothing else.
Well, I remember saying maybe
like
he calmed down when he had the kid.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I think to some degree the creation was an experiment, and some of the traditions I follow talk about it as, you know, Muslim tradition, God created the animals who do not know what they are and cannot change. Angels who do know what they are, but cannot change. And finally, he said, I want somebody more like me. And he created man, who can know who he is,
right,
and can change.
Agree. Yes, that is also a relatively mainstream Jewish viewpoint.
And he has to learn it. We were born with the capacity for it, but it wasn't pre-installed at the factory.
Correct. Yes, I think that is. I mean, I'm not mean like, yeah, correct. That's how the world works. I'm saying like, yes, that is a relatively mainstream viewpoint, and it is a viewpoint like outside of that cosmology, like you're going to run into difficulty eventually in Solomonic magic if you don't believe that, because that is kind of like the underlying assumptions in Solomonic magic. So you need to at least behave as if you like believe they are true in order to not necessarily work Solomonic magic, but once you kind of get in the weeds of the theory, like the theory won't make sense without those kind of assumptions.
Right. And to kick back a little bit to Arnett's comment,
Mm-hmm.
I think it was an incredibly risky move on God's part, because he knew what he was capable of doing if he made a bad decision. And he gave us that capacity. Now, I was going to say fortunate, but no, we do have the ability to wipe out the world. But it does mean that when you go around, you'd say 2 Jews, 3 opinions. I think you could do that with any group of people.
Well, I think so too, but let me highlight something we mean by that. Unlike, say, Catholicism, where the Catholic Church has a doctrine, and Catholics can believe it or not. I mean, in my experience, very few Catholics believe every single piece of Catholic doctrine, but there is Catholic doctrine. Like, it's not like most pieces of it are not up for debate. Like, that doesn't exist in Judaism. There is nothing you can believe that will make you not Jewish if you are, and nothing you can believe that will make you Jewish if you're not. Like, Judaism just is not built out of orthodoxy. Even the most Orthodox Jews would not say that there is anything you can believe that makes you not Jewish. You might be, in their opinion, like, I might be doing it wrong, but I have never once had an Orthodox Jew suggest I am not Jewish, and I am a straight up devil worshiper. Like, not even just one devil, like a whole lot of them. By the way, so was King Solomon, if you read Torah, and particularly if you read Talmud. The rabbis don't care for it, but he was definitely engaging in idolatry. They give him shit for it all the time.
Define worship, then.
I'll say how I mean worship, which is not exactly how a mainstream Jewish definition. So I really like a definition. I stole this definition from Ian Corrigan, that worship, right, is action performed in return for blessing.
Okay.
Right? That if you're worship, what is it? It's stuff you do that results in blessing, or is at least intended to result in blessing. Right? And that doesn't mean it's tit for tat, right? But that's kind of the category of worship. That being said, that's in Judaism, there's specific actions that are and are not acceptable. So if you would I can send you 2 pages of rabbis discussing if you come upon a herm, which is a kind of altar to Hermes made out of a pile of rocks, right? And you throw a rock at it. Well, if you throw a rock at a normal idol, that's obviously not idol worship, but this is a pile of rocks, and throwing rocks at it might be considered putting a rock on that pile, and that is forbidden. There are thousands of pages of historic documents of rabbis discussing the very fine points of your question.
There is an absolutely hilarious Facebook post that probably was originally Twitter or something else on whether or not a dragon can light the Passover candles. And this is, if it's being compelled to, it's a...
Well, Passover candles definitely, but Shabbat candles, that is a more complicated question.
Would it have to be a female?
Into whether the dragon had self-will or was a pet.
If the dragon wants,
or otherwise.
I honestly feel like the key component is whether or not the dragon is Jewish.
Yeah.
That
I think is the key component in that question, and then all the other questions are kind of
can a dragon be Jewish?
I would say no from a technical rabbinic standpoint, but maybe. I was about to say no. I don't see if a dragon can speak and understand, right? It is able to communicate and learn and understand, and wanted to convert to Judaism, I don't see any reason why they would be prohibited from doing so.
And I believe that this digression has demonstrated exactly what you were talking about.
Exactly.
About being able to debate anything.
Right. And that's what I mean. That's what we mean when we say like 2 Jews, 3 opinions. But I want to come back to some stuff that Griffin Brook was saying. So I am in no way saying you're wrong. But those things you said about like it being a risky move on God's part it would be very hard to construct an opinion like that inside Judaism because it suggests that things exist that aren't God. Right? But Judaism, like it's like real hard monotheism, right? Or even panentheism. So like there's no other option. Like it's not risky for God because God exists at all points in space at once, and everything he's doing, he knows all the consequences of it. And that creation in Judaism is not like a once and done thing. Like moment by moment, God is breathing, becoming into being. Right? Like it's this ongoing activity.
I remember seeing a definition of the Tetragrammaton, a translation of the name of God. Instead of being I am that I am, I become that I become. And that one really rang for me.
So let me talk a little bit about that. First of all, the name you're discussing isn't the Tetragrammaton, which is Yud He Vav He. So you're talking about another name for God, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which is
Thank you for the correction.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, like, again, Christian translations, in my opinion, intentionally obfuscate the text. So, like, if you're only ever reading Christian Torah translations, I don't know how you would conceivably know that because the translator went out of their way to prevent you from knowing that, in my opinion. Like there's a lot of different names for God being used, and broadly, I find Christian translations make no attempt to distinguish between them, and indeed, from my point of view, seem to intentionally occlude the distinctions. So, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh is one of my very favorite names for God. So it's the name that when Moses finds the burning bush, right?
Oh.
So, and here's a little piece of midrash of Jewish folklore, right? And it says that bush had been on fire the whole fucking time. But Moses always had his head up in the clouds or like down in a book and like look at his feet, like not looking at where he was going. And so he walked right past that burning bush all the time because he was just not paying attention. But so one day he finds this burning bush and it's clearly an epiphany of God, right? And they have a whole little conversation. And one of the things and the bush charges Moses to like go tell the Jewish people some stuff, right? And not yet the 10 Commandments, like some other stuff, right? And Moses is like, well, who should I say sent me? And Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh is the name that is given. And that is a very hard name to translate for a lot of reasons. But one of them is that like verb tenses don't work exactly the same way in Hebrew as they do in English. So Ehyeh is a form of the verb to be, and it is closer to being in the present tense, I will be, than it is to being in the present tense, I am, right? So like a better translation will be like, I will be what I will be. Personally, my favorite translation is like a poetic one that is, I am being becoming. But there are a lot of other ways to read it, including like maybe this is some kind of like who's on first situation where God is like, just tell him it was me. Like I am beingness.
Popeye.
Yeah, right. Like there's a whole, there's a lot of ways to read that. And so I think there's like 2 pages of this exact discussion in the book. If you want to read more, I will pull it out.
I would like to get into a discussion with you at some other time as to the intersection between Moses and Canaanite lore.
Well, I mean, the short answer is that like there is no such thing as cultural purity in any culture anywhere ever.
I wasn't expecting.
And so like Mosaic lore and Canaanite lore intersect in a lot of complex ways.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting you talk about the, whether it's I am what I am or I will be what I'm going to be, which by the way, he says will, not shall. So he's talking about.
Well, he doesn't say either will or shall is actually what he's saying.
Well, okay. If neither can be inferred, then you can't distinguish between a historical prediction and an intention. But this whole kind of, you were saying, well, tell him it's me. There's a series of poems by Rumi that were collected under the title Fihi Ma Fihi. And it's usually translated as "in it, what's in it,"
Mm-hmm.
and it has that same concept. And I remember the introduction reading about the wonderfully goofy title, and with this kind of hands thrown up attitude of, "What do you want me to say?
Yeah.
My God, how do I say that?" Yeah.
Arabic and Hebrew are very closely related languages, although I suppose, I mean, well, all right, I'm going to just put that on pause for a second, what I was about to say. But also, I mean, theologically, broadly, I would say Islam and Judaism are much closer than either is to Christianity. Like, they're much more similar. I mean, in particular, like the monotheism aspect is a little fuzzy in Christianity, right? So yeah, I don't really remember what the beginning of that Sherry question was, but I think I answered it, right?
Yes.
Let me see if there's the Mather's Pentacles were the ones Herman used to sell at the Magical Chat. Yeah, I mean the Mather's Pentacles, like unless the person is a like deep specialist, like the only ones you're ever gonna see are the Mather's Pentacles. And I mean, I don't know who Herman is. Like they might be a specialist, but I don't think they can sell those specialty pentacles because nobody knows them. There's that Skinner book. Don't ask chat. I mean, I have never found I've played with ChatGPT a lot, and you know what I find it really useful for? So in STEM, right, we are taught a practice called the rubber duck practice or the desk duck practice, where like, I think it originates in some specific book on programming, but I learned it in math grad school. And it's like, you keep a duck on your desk. This is my duck. Her name is Penelope, right? And when you're stuck, you just like explain things to the duck. And I find ChatGPT slightly more useful than an inanimate duck for that.
I thought that it was a yellow pig.
I was taught like a rubber ducky, but I have a fancy duck that I happen to inherit this cool duck statue from my late grandmother. So like I use this instead of I was taught a rubber ducky, but I don't think it, is super relevant exactly what it is.
It's a math nerd thing.
I actually think it's a programming nerd thing that I learned it in math, but somebody recently told me that actually it's in some specific programming textbook, but I don't remember the textbook name, but probably somebody listening does.
I remember it circulating when I was a test engineer.
Yeah, I mean,
and now suddenly I'm having suspicions because Feather hid little tiny ducks all over the house.
Oh, adorable.
And I wonder if she's trying to tell me something here about inspiration.
So
well, I am, it's unconscious.
Yeah, I do find ChatGPT, like when I'm stuck, when I can't figure out how to explain something, like if I'm blocked when I'm writing, sometimes I will try and explain it to ChatGPT and then be like, what do you think? And then it says something which is so stupid and wrong that like correcting its stupid wrongness gets me unstuck.
That's wonderful.
But like, that's honestly, like, I will say, I mean, even questions that like are not, like there is unquestionably a single correct answer to them. Like I have asked it like, what is the twin primes hypothesis? That's not like a subjective question. There is a correct answer to that question. And it has gotten every single one of those questions I've asked it wrong. Like very wrong.
I have seen it
like
described as mansplaining as a service.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically just like really fancy autocorrect. I'll tell you, I'm sure it's good for lots of things. The thing I do in my business that I hate among the most is writing newsletters. I hate writing newsletters. They're like the most like just straight up marketing thing that I do. And I just don't like writing them. And sometimes I've been doing the same thing where I try and get ChatGPT to write them and they're bad. But starting with ChatGPT's terribleness and then fixing it is sometimes when I'm stuck, it's easier than starting with a blank page. But unless I'm stuck, it's actually much harder. Like it's much easier to write things yourself than it is to get the correct ChatGPT written ones. But I find them like its wrongness makes me angry, and angry is a good inspiration. Like, that angry Kermit one where that definitely.
I'm just to bring us back.
Oh, hell no.
Yeah, sorry.
We've kind of used up our hour, but Zoom doesn't make us get off. Does anybody
I'm happy to keep
any
talking.
other questions that are pertinent to this or can I turn off the recording?
Well, Star Wolf asked a question in chat right near
Oh,
the
did I miss
end.
one?
Yeah, and since he's gone
okay.
now, I'd like to raise the question on his behalf.
Sure.
So that would be another question. Where do the 6th and 7th books of Moses fall into Solomonic magic?
Okay, I mean, the 6th and 7th books of magic are quite early Hellenic Jewish magical texts, very solidly in Solomonic magic. If that, oh, somebody asked about like the magic of Moses. If that's what they were asking before, sorry, I didn't understand the question.
I think that was specifically what he was asking.
Yeah, so those texts are very squarely in the Solomonic magic tradition. I don't know exact dates off the top of my head, but they're quite early. They're like mid-late antiquity, maybe like, I'm gonna just make a wild guess here. So like some nerd listening maybe knows the answer to this question, but I'm gonna say they are maybe like 2nd century BCE to like 4th century CE, but maybe a little later. I'm not very good at exact dates, but they're definitely Hellenistic Jewish Solomonic magic texts from late antiquity. I mean, I don't know. You could, like anything, I guess you could get real fussy about what the exact edges are and aren't of Solomonic magic. But I mean, yeah. So the book apparently is called Pragmatic Programmer, written in 1990.
Chipicon, what about your question about a Bremelin that was just above that one?
Okay, so let me give a little bit of context for what the Book of Abramelin is. So the Book of Abramelin is a Solomonic text. Again, I'm not good at dates. I'm going to say probably late 1500s. Oh, actually, if I think about it, I do know almost exactly. It's like the date that the text claims for itself, I think is, no, 6th and 7th. Am I mixing up which one is the 6th and 7th book of Moses and which one? I am talking about, there's a book. Okay, I'm sorry I said wrong things. The book I was talking about is definitely, oh, no. I really feel like there is a Hellenistic Greek text called the 6th book of Moses. I'm sure I have just mixed up the name. Maybe that book is called something else. And I'm just stupid. 8th and 10th books of Moses. That is exactly what I meant. Thank you. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, so the 6th and 7th. No. Please. Whoever, like Matt,
Cool.
Whoever just said, don't mean to disrupt.
That was Matt. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would always rather be corrected than be wrong. Yeah, I was definitely talking about the 10th. I was talking specifically about the 10th book of Moses. I'm a little dyslexic. I'm not great at like keeping names together. Yeah, no, the 6th and 7th books of Moses are relatively late Solomonic texts that are pulling on really, I would say, a lot of antecedents, but in particular that 10th book of Moses that I was talking about. That is not to say, I mean, I don't know that I cannot speak to the intent of the author of the 6th and 7th book of Moses. I am not super duper familiar with those texts. In general, I am much more familiar with earlier texts than later texts. Yeah, thank you for correcting me. Okay, so the Book of Abramelin, though, right, is like I said, I think the text itself claims maybe around like 1440 or something. For the date, maybe the text itself is a little bit later. So it's in pieces, right? The first piece is sort of like a complicated frame story about where this magic came from. That's a relatively common feature in Solomonic texts, right? And then, sorry, my brain is turning off, right? And then in book 2, there's like an initiatory, a self-initiation into this style of angelic magic, which culminates in knowledge and conversation of one's holy guardian angel, which is a kind of a tutelary spirit, right?
The one that's on the roof with the hawk head and facing the morning sun or something.
No, that's in PGM 1. That's like the very first thing in PGM. So, but it's in that same category of spell. Like it's a spell designed to like acquire a spirit familiar, I would say. It's like the same
like
kind
a
of
Horus invocation.
in the PGM. Yeah, absolutely. It is a Horus invocation. And I think it's built out of Ephesian grammata. But again, I don't like, look, I'm doing my best, guys, but like, I don't have every text in the world memorized.
You like, just got home when we brought you on.
Yeah. So again, I apologize for,
I should let you go. Everybody who wants to say thank you, say thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to finish what I was saying about Abramelin though first, if that's okay.
Okay, well then I won't stop recording until you've said it.
So the Book of Abramelin, right, presents book 1, frame story, book 2, this initiatory ritual, and then at the end, it presents a ton of Hebrew amulets, right, which are, again, very in with, like, there's a broad, well-understood tradition, well-understood to people who care to learn such things, a tradition of, like, Hebrew amulet magic, which is a living tradition and well-preserved textual tradition as well, that like the seals in the Book of Abramelin and the Solomonic Pentacles are all participating in this broader category of Hebrew amulets, and they're all quite consistent. Like there's just ways that such things work, and they kind of work the same. One day maybe I'll try and decrypt all the Abramelin squares.
One of the things that I noticed in the book was that you seem to have a really close personal relationship with Solomon.
Yeah. So I've been focusing mostly on like the second half of the book in this interview, right? Talking about like the really nitty gritty of the Pentacles. But like I said, there's this on-ramp into Solomonic magic in like the first third of the book. And so I am in no way suggesting this is the only way to approach Solomonic magic. It's just like one particular on-ramp. And it's what I call the SLM method. Now, SLM are my initials, Sara Mastros. They are S. Samuel Little Mather's initials. Right? Like McGregor is not the name his mama gave him. Like, right. I mean, I'm not trying to dead name him. I'm just explaining that his initials are SLM. McGregor is like a nickname, right? But it is also Shin Lamed Mem is the Hebrew word, the Hebrew root, right? That gives rise to the most familiar one would probably be shalom, which means peace. Also the Arabic salam, which also means peace. And it's also the root. It's also most names for Semitic names for Venus evening star, right? It's because its root means really like evening or west or sunset or rest. And then by sort of metaphoric extension, you get to meanings like peace from there. It's also the root of Solomon's name, right? And so that's why I've got this SLM method, right? The first pillar of that is Solomon himself, right? Solomon, the great magician king, legendarily the wisest man who ever lived, the man whose name is peace. So like, I don't want to get too preachy right now, right? But, you know, when David was king of Israel, he was at war with basically all of his neighbors throughout his entire reign, right? And David had many wonderful qualities, but no one extols David for his wisdom, right? In fact, there's a lot of problems with David, right? He fell in love with his BFF's wife, Bathsheba. His friend Uriah was a general in his army. He was stooping Bathsheba behind Uriah's back, and when she got pregnant, he sent Uriah on a suicide mission to get him out of the way so he could marry Bathsheba. And that's Solomon's mother. That baby, however, is not Solomon. That baby dies, right? And so rabbis will tell you sometimes, there are many reasons why Solomon is named what he is. Some people will say it is because David had made peace with God, right? And is naming something that. But I mean, from a historical or mythological standpoint, what is the important feature of Solomon's reign, right? In as much as Solomon is a real person, right, who is talking, and like the hagiography of him in the Book of Kings is talking about a real period in Jewish history, even though in the context of Torah, it's placed in like the 10th century, in other contexts of history, it's probably more like the 8th century BC, right? And this is the time when Israel makes peace with all her neighbors, right? So Solomon famously made peace with all his neighbors. He was a skilled negotiator. He married Pharaoh's daughter to seal an alliance with Egypt, right? Like, in fact, he has hundreds of wives because that's his like normal method for sealing a peace treaty is he marries the neighboring king's daughter, or sister sometimes, right? And he makes peace. Like that is the root of Solomon's wisdom, right? Israel becomes strong, becomes prosperous, becomes like an important player on the world stage at this point in history, right? And that is rooted in peace. And so I guess I'm going to say, like, flat out that Israel is at its best when it makes peace. And I feel like that is a thing that should be happening, right? And I think there is no way to genuinely talk about Solomon as an ally without sort of giving that little sermon. So I'm going to give that little sermon, right? But I do think that, like, a relationship with Solomon himself, right, as a spirit is one of the cornerstones of at least the way I practice Solomonic magic. And so that sort of chapter in my book is based on, I hang out in like a lot of beginner magician groups, and I often see this question, like, what spirit should I conjure to learn Solomonic magic? And I'm like, it's Solomon, bro. Like, it's right there in the name, actually. It's Solomon. So I work a lot with Solomon as a spirit among the dead, conjuring him in dreams, which I think is the easiest way for most beginners to get like first contact with most spirits, is in dreams, and then move on from there. The L in Solomonic magic is, in the book, it's logos, but I'll tell you, in writing this book, I really went back and forth a lot between like logos and language and linguistics for that L. But in the book, I settled on logos. But now in interviews, I'm like, oh, I should have said linguistics, right? And that's really what I've been talking about a lot, right? Is that core. And then the M is magic. That magic is really, really fucking for real. It's not a metaphor. Like, I mean fucking magic. So like, people are like, oh, King Solomon couldn't have written the Key of Solomon in the 1400s. I'm like, well, if you don't think a dead person can write a book, like, I don't know, man, do you even magic? So that is the third pillar of my method. And so I teach a method for construction of a living magic book, like a book that has its own awake spirit. And in this book, we're learning to make a book of Pentacles, right? But really the method will work for any kind of like spirit book. So as you move into other kinds of Solomonic magic, you can make your own angelic, like book of angels, a book of demons, like the same method more or less will work for any kind of living book.
Okay, you just said demons, and they talk about demons a lot with Solomon.
Sure.
And how he like locked gins up in bottles and stuff like that. How much confusion is sown by translation from one language to another, what these entities were?
Ooh, I mean, I don't have like some perfect non-culturally biased answer to that question, but I mean, yeah, I think that like language and culture, I think that not only do individuals have biases, languages have biases. And in particular, like, you know, we've spent most of the last millennium burning to death anyone who dared talk about magic out loud in English. So English does not have a robust vocabulary for talking about magic stuff. So I think generally, you know, my intro to witchcraft class is being translated into Chinese. And it is fascinating because they do have a very rich and robust vocabulary for talking about it. At least it seems that way to me, right? That like, it's really fascinating to see like how that class is evolving differently. So like they just learned to make sigils, and they're making sigils out of logograms, which are themselves kind of already sigils. And they have this whole sophisticated like technology behind it. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of bias in any language. I will say the Greek word daimon really means any kind of spirit. So for example, the Orphic hymns routinely refer to gods as demons in Greek, daimonis, right? I mean,
well, Sarah, you mentioned contacting Solomon by way of dreams.
Yes.
Now, other people have talked about dreams and so forth. If you run into the wrong person in a dream, you could be in trouble. Now, is Solomon, in your opinion, a generally benign and helpful spirit, or just one that you should approach with proper respect for his majesty?
Well, I guess I would suggest that in the other place, which I think of the dreaming as at least like close neighbors to like the magical other place, right? I would encourage you to treat everyone with respect, just like you would a person.
Having invoked the spirit of Faustina the Elder at one point, because I was in the Getty Villa, and one of the statues started looking back at me.
Right.
When I invited her into my home, I cleared a space and put a basin of water and a glass of wine at the place where I was intending for her to manifest to whatever degree she chose.
Right.
Apparently it was enough.
Yeah. I mean,
was when she left and Antoninus showed up afterwards. My
mhm.
dog got off the couch.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know how to answer that question about Solomon. I have always found Solomon to be like extremely friendly, but that's my cousin. Like, that's my blood ancestor, in addition to like me being his initiate, and I'm a big old nerd. Like, of course he's gonna like me. I mean, I will say, if we look at, there's huge amounts of hagiography of Solomon. So the oldest stories about Solomon we have that sort of paint his character are the Book of Kings, but there's many other biblical texts. So the book Kohelet, which is, I guess Christians call Ecclesiastes. Fun fact, Kohelet is a female word. It's a little weird that we ascribe it to Solomon. There's a lot of rabbinic discussion about why that is, right? You can learn more about his character. I mean, Solomon's a badass, so if you piss him off, I'm sure he could fuck with you. But generally, the word Kohelet is usually translated as either teacher or preacher. But it really just means like someone who can command the attention of the Kohel, command the attention of the assembly. Like, if you stand up on a soapbox and you can get people to listen to you, Kohelet. Right. And I find that the sort of person who can do that, like myself, is perhaps a person who likes to talk. So Solomon loves to talk, so it's pretty easy to get him to talk. Like, especially if what you want is to learn his magic, he's into that. Like, he wants to teach that to you. So I've never say that again.
I said, that's my kind of spirit.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be surprised. I mean, I think generally the mighty dead, like, they get that way, like what Christians would call saints. Like, the way they get that way is because they want to talk to people and they're generally understood to be friendly. And so, what I teach in the book is basically an icon practice, like a relatively Greek Orthodox style icon practice. This is my preferred icon of Solomon. It's in the book. Like, this picture is reproduced in the book, but this happens to be my favorite icon. But like, I don't know if the Catholics understand Solomon. I don't really know. In as much as I know about Christianity, it's usually Greek Orthodox Christianity, right? So I don't know quite what the situation is in Catholicism, but in Orthodoxy, like, King Solomon is understood to be a saint. And so like there's a whole living practice of like veneration of Solomon among the mighty dead. And the practice I teach is relatively similar to that practice, right? And I've never heard of anybody having bad results, but I mean, I don't know, if you're a warmonger, maybe he doesn't care for you. Like, you know what I mean? I will say though, Solomon, I think, is forgiving, right? So there are 3 rules for the king of Israel, right? Biblically, that you not, let me think about how to say this in English, that you not hoard money, right? And I want to be clear, we're not, like, these are rules for kings. We're not talking about savings. We're talking about sitting on top of a giant fucking pile of gold like a dragon while people starve to death. We mean hoarding money like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk's hoards money, right? That's against the rules for kings, right? Okay, it's a little complicated. Technically what it says is proliferating horses, but what it means in context is proliferating weapons of war. Like, in the context, horses are, at least in the cultural context that text is written in, horses are really exclusively weapons of war, right? Not allowed to proliferate weapons of war, and you're not allowed to, it's a little complicated, but what I would say is you're not allowed to marry casually. Like, if you marry somebody, you need to fucking mean it, right? Well, Solomon, if you read his hagiography, he fails all of those rules over the course of his reign. And rabbis would say that's why that whole Ashmedai situation happens. Like, Solomon is vulnerable to the demon king Ashmedai, with whom he has had a long and complex relationship, right? And that point in the story, but like, he becomes vulnerable because of that. And so if you look at this story of Solomon, you'll see over and over in his hagiography, I think the main takeaway from Solomon textually in his hagiography, not just in Torah, but in Muslim sources, in Christian sources, in folkloric sources, like in every story about Solomon, like the essence of it is this, right? that when Solomon doesn't have a partner, so early in his life, his partners are his mother and Nathan the prophet, right? That's really who puts him on the throne. He's not the natural heir, right? And then the Queen of Sheba is his partner for a while, right? And then Naamah, the woman he marries in the court of Jordan, right? The princess of Jordan, Ammon, but modern Jordan, right? Like that even the wisest man in the world, when he doesn't have partners to call him on his bullshit, like he becomes corrupt. And I think of that as
an awful lot like Doctor Who. He needs a companion to keep him on track.
I mean, I don't know much about Doctor Who, but I will say that, like, as I understand it, the companion role in Doctor Who is not a partner. It is very much a subservient role to the Doctor.
I would have to argue that based on
maybe.
some recent
Okay.
episodes. But
Real talk, I have seen maybe, like, okay, I know I shouldn't say this out loud because everybody's going to hate on me. I don't really like Doctor Who. But the kind of circles I move in, people refuse to believe that. And so they constantly make me watch episodes. So they're like 6 or 7 episodes of Doctor Who that I've seen many, many times because friends and boyfriends and whoever make me watch them. I don't get it. I'm too autistic. I'm like, does that compute? Why does human think this is funny? I don't get it. So again, I could be totally wrong about Doctor Who. I don't really know from Doctor Who.
As much as I'm with everybody about not getting enough of Sarah.
We gotta go. I'll just
I have to stop the recording now.
Absolutely.
And so everybody say thank you, and I will stop the recording.
Thank you guys. You had such fabulous questions.
Wait a minute. There it is. Stop.